Good morning to everyone who is in the same time zone as us. Good afternoon, good evening to everybody else in different time zones. We're very pleased to welcome you today to a webinar with our guest academic, Professor Nelly Stromquist, who's going to speak to us on the basis of a paper that was published in 2015, which had the title Women's Empowerment in Education, Linking Knowledge to Transformative Action. This presentation then is by Professor Stromquist, who is Professor of International Education Policy in the Department of Counseling, Higher Education and Special Education at the College of Education, University of Maryland. Professor Stromquist specializes in issues related to social change and gender, which she examines from the perspective of critical sociology. Her research interests focus on the dynamics of educational policies and practices, gender relations and equity, particularly focusing in Latin America. Professor Stromquist's presentation will be followed by some questions, hopefully from those of you who've joined us from afar. And I have some questions already myself, which I'll put to her. So welcome and thank you very much for being with us this morning. Over to you.
My pleasure to be here and my pleasure to address all of you who might be watching this webinar. The discussion is really going to emphasize question and answers. I will just briefly say what led me discuss the question of empowerment, the concept of empowerment. And it's a notion that started when I was trying to explain why progress on the question of gender advancement and changes in the social relations of gender has taken so long. There has always been action by agencies. There have been actions by governments. There have been actions by non-governmental organizations, especially women-led organizations. But overall, and you could say perhaps I'm being impatient, but change has been much slower than one would desire. So that led me to consider some of the contributions coming from developing countries, especially contributions coming from India, where the concept of empowerment really had its origins. And what became clear to me over time was that to have change in the social relations of gender, you have to act simultaneously on 4 different dimensions. And these dimensions are difficult to implement. Nonetheless, if those dynamics and those processes are not taken into account, we are acting in a very fragmented way and in a way that doesn't reinforce each of the perennial problems that we have. My notion then of empowerment is that all these 4 dimensions, the economic, the political, the social, and the psychological, really are what in the terminology today is being called co-evolutionary, meaning that they have to evolve at the same time, that you cannot just accelerate one and wait for the other or then move to the other. In these dimensions, it's all in my paper and I can leave with you a PowerPoint that further will explain that. The main points that I would want to make about these 4 dimensions is that they implicate 2 very crucial aspects. One is that to change the social relations of gender, you have to pay attention both to the public arena, the arena of the governments, the arena of the policies, and also to the public arena, namely what happens in the domestic sphere, what happens in the family, what happens in the household. They interact very powerful with each other. And most of the time, policies seem to consider essentially the public arena. So that is a difficulty that has to be addressed. And we have to think of the best ways to consider that interaction between the 2, not to lose sight that those are active all the time. And the other aspect that I think is also important to take into account is that the progress, the advancement that may happen, that will happen in the advancement of women's conditions is not just, which is not just for the question of having more women in positions that men usually have, but is something that is attempting to have a social transformation, a new culture, right? is going to be an area in which it will be necessary to pay attention to the important need to engage in macro level policies and to engage in micro level policies, to address, as I have said, both areas. And I would say perhaps a third dimension, a third aspect, is that when we think of the promoters of change, the promoters of questioning the current status, those who are undergoing, those who experience the positions of disadvantage, the positions of marginality, have to be directly involved. It's not something that you can relegate to each other, right? So along those lines, then, what I am proposing is that we pay attention to issues that sometimes are marginalized or sometimes are taken for granted, and that the effort to change relations has to be one in which everybody is implicated, right? It cannot just be that we want women to advance. We also want men to have a different understanding of what a new society could be, right? So essentially then is working for the advancement, but also working for transformation at the same time. I would like to address your questions, which I found were very good.
Okay.
Yes? So do you mind reiterating them? Begin
Sure,
with the
yeah.
first question.
You all bear with us. It's our first webinar, so we're learning as we go along. So after reading the article myself, I have 3 questions that I wanted to put to Nelly. And the first question is around thinking about the fact that if we look back over the last 20 years or so, we can see that there's gradually been a shift in the language that policymakers use, and by now also in the language that activists and women's rights organizations use. So we don't hear so much about women's rights anymore, and we're certainly focusing more and more on women's empowerment. And I think we see that, at all levels, global, regional, national, local. And I think that some activists, women's rights activists, would argue that this is perhaps a rather cynical but also deliberate shift by policymakers. And it's a way of diluting some of the very strong language and the strong agenda that was achieved with the endorsement of the Beijing Platform for Action, where really the focus on the recognition of women's rights as human rights was a very powerful moment and really opened the door for a strong anchoring of that work in existing legal frameworks and a recognizable and strongly embedded human rights approach to work. So would you agree that this shift has occurred, and would you agree with the criticism which says that policymakers have done this deliberately to kind of dilute a little bit what was originally a very strong agenda?
I find your question excellent, and at the same time it has many layers that I would like to address. One is certainly that the term empowerment has been adopted by many agencies and even by governments, right? If you look carefully, perhaps you come to the realization that more than adopted is co-opted, right? Yeah. Because many of the principles, many of the insights have been lost, right? That empowerment now is used certainly as a concept, but if you look into what is actually meant, at heart continues to be the notion of parity, right? Mm-hmm. Parity, meaning equal numbers of men and women. Parity is by no means to be underestimated, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's a precursor to presence and then to possible changes, but it shouldn't stop there, right? And also, when you look at the concept, you will find that for some reason, they might have a justification because certainly it's not presented in terms of a conceptual understanding, of a theoretical understanding of what gender subordination means. They emphasize the economic and the political dimensions, right? And again, it's in terms of parity, right? More women as politicians, more women as managers of enterprises. Again, the reason that this term has been co-opted is that not a reason in terms of the motivation that they might have, but why we say that the term has been co-opted is that only some of the dimensions of empowerment are taken into account, right? And what is more damaging of it all is that the notion of process, the notion of dynamics is out of the picture, right? And the question is, how do you get there, right? You want to have more representation. How do you get there? What do you have to change in order for that representation to be possible? That either is taken for granted or discarded as part of a strategy to put in place, right? The term empowerment, I agree with you, has been co-opted by agencies. Many of them use it, but it's not a use in terms of what the feminist movement would say is a proper term. It's better to be there than not to be there, right? So in that sense, some progress has taken place, but much more of a discussion, much more of a negotiation has to take place for that term to really mean what it was intended in its origins. Again, for that, then, we need greater participation of those who are affected by the situation in the redefinition or in the recovering of the definition. That is a very difficult step, and it's very obvious when you see all the efforts that are being put in place, let us say today, with the global policies of the Sustainable Development Goals, right? When it comes to indicators, it's mostly a discussion of experts. So civil society is not present there. Not even civil society in the larger sense of the word, not to mention what is happening to women in the women's movement. And let me give you as an example of some of the co-optation, and if I may use the term, distortion of the term empowerment. the SDGs, right, have at this moment a goal that came certainly as much of as a result of the efforts by civil society to have it. Yeah? I'm referring to SDG 5, right? SDG 5. It talks about equality and empowerment, right? I think that by fusing the two concepts, both of them lose, okay? Because part of empowerment is certainly equality, but equality is not empowerment, right? So I think that a greater differentiation between the two terms would be very helpful. So what is SDG 5 saying in terms of the indicators for empowerment? Let me go a little bit back in the past, and recall what the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, had to say about gender. They had goal number 3, right? And the target at that particular point was a tripartite set of indicators that also carried from previous efforts, right? So they were asking for the proportion of women who are in public office. This time, the SDGs have augmented that to say not just in parliamentary office, but in local office, which is, I think, is fine. Then they have, let me go back. I'm moving ahead of myself. In the MDGs, they had these two indicators: right? Women in public office, women in economic positions, and then they had education, right? And education was all levels of education. Certainly by 2015, there should have been access by men and women to all levels of education. Now, if you look at SDG 5s, right? The SDG 5s at first sight seem progress because now we have more indicators than before on the question of empowerment. I think it has 6 indicators, right? And those, vis-a-vis the previous indicators, the MDG 4, they continue the political and the economic. The education one has been taken out, so I guess it's bad, when they are talking about universal education. You could say, well, editorially speaking, you don't want to have repetition, but conceptually speaking, it belongs there, so it shouldn't have been taken out, right? In the past, and I continue to be critical of the assertions that are made to the liberatory, emancipatory power of education, right? It depends what you are learning. certainly being in an educational institution in a school opens your horizons because you do get new ideas, better analysis, ways of understanding the past. You gain by being in school, even though that might not be reflected in these tests. But that education per se is not emancipatory, right? And the main evidence that we have about that is that most of the efforts that took place to have women's advancement came from countries in which, complete secondary education had already been achieved, and in which a large proportion of the women already had higher education, right? So education certainly does a lot for persons, for mentalities, for appreciation, for analysis, but alone, right, regardless of context and regardless of content, is not going to make that big of a difference, right? So you need to pay attention to education. And in the dimensions that I talk about empowerment, an important dimension is knowledge. I don't call it education, I call it knowledge because it's what you actually absorb and are able to digest and engage with. So if that dimension now has been taken out, right, a very important aspect of what can be, used in dynamics, used in process, has been taken out. In that sense, I think that the SDGs, even though they intend to make a big contribution, have some regressive aspects to that. Then I would like to address the question of human rights, right? I think that human rights, especially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is an extremely valuable document, right? It put on the table, it brought to the surface for the first time all kinds of principles, right, that make it possible for human beings to have a decent existence, right? Political rights, civil rights, economic rights. So, a major contribution of 1948, right? It's not a major contribution. I mean, it has a number of aspects that we would like to have today, 2017, right? So let's take that document in terms of its original value and say it has a great deal to contribute, right? Now, what does human rights do for women, right? Several things. I think it has been a major triumph of the women's movement to say what women are claiming, right, should be inscribed into human rights, which is another way to say women are as human beings as men are, right? Which is something very basic but needed to be explicit, right? Now, in terms of what human rights can do for women, if you look at the text, it has very little to do with women. It's just women certainly are parts of the human race, and therefore all these principles apply to them, right? And if you look further to what it has two articles that could be very negative for women, right? And let me refer you to them. The first one is Article 12, right? And what is Article 12 saying? I'm looking at my notes and now I don't find this. Yes. Article 12 is saying essentially the principle of, you remember the old adage that a home is a man's castle, yes, right? So the Article 12 says the private life belongs to the individual, right? And where the individual does that is beyond interference. If we pay attention to the importance of the household, of the private arena, in generating notions of masculinity, femininity, generating experiences of violence, right? Domestic violence is the prime complaint that women have across the world. Then you could say, I can invoke Article 12 and you have nothing to do with me. It's my domain and it's untouchable, right? So that's one aspect that I think could be interpreted as not really favoring women. Although when we invoke human rights, we're invoking the whole document. The other article is Article 18. What is that article saying? This is perhaps not that politically correct. But it has, in a process of social change, we have to leave aside, sensitivities. We have to say what is might be damaging. So Article 18 is saying everybody has a right to her own religion, right? And to the practices that entails, right? Again, that particular point, even though invokes something that most of us would be respectful for, I mean, you have your right to believe in whatever entity you want, or not to believe in any entity, but it's a result of your practice. You are engaging in some negative consequences for someone else. That religion, yes, religion quotations, cannot be considered exempt from being criticized or being taken as an object of change. Again, in the Human Declaration, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that article can be served to say, in my religion, according to my religion, I believe that women should do A, B, and C, right? Then you cannot say much of that, right? So, regarding human rights, then I have two things to say. One is that it does not necessarily protect women through some articles. It talks about human beings in general. And the other one, which I think is the strongest observation that I could make about human rights, is that human rights, the Declaration of Human Rights, is a document drafted by states, right? That commit the states to behave, right? So it's something that we expect the state to do for us, right? And that, I think, is a contradiction vis-a-vis the process of change, right? Why would a state that has traditionally been patriarchal, has protected the status quo, see in its best interest to act on behalf of women, right? And certainly we need to put pressure on the state. We need legislation. We need that monitoring. We need that nationwide enforcement, right? But to fully put our confidence in the state, I think, would be premature and also might not be that functional, right? Because of that, I think that while human rights is important, right? The concept of empowerment does not necessarily contradict that you should have a state that does things for the betterment of women, but are two different things, right? Empowerment is saying you want to have change, you have to act on your own, right? Both individually and collectively, right? And the other thing would be, of course, put pressure on the state, expect the state to work. But again, it's not going to be just by itself, right? So that would be my answer to.
Okay, so to summarize, thank you. You brought in many layers in your answer too, but I guess I could summarize and say that your response is suggesting that, well, if there has been a shift from talking about women's rights and the human rights framework to focusing on empowerment, that's not necessarily a bad thing because of the number of things that you just pointed out about the declaration and some of the key articles in the declaration.
Yes.
I've got you right.
Yes.
Okay. We can come back to some of that later. I'll move on to the second question I wanted to put to you, that your conceptualization of empowerment is both, I would say, broad and deep. And you argue quite strongly that states and international development agencies have shown themselves incapable, perhaps even unwilling, to take up such a broad and deep agenda. So the responsibility ends up falling on women's rights and feminist organizations. But I'm wondering whether this isn't a potential trap, because you also point out that these organizations, women's rights organizations, have lost a lot of donor support, and indeed today, as we sit here, they continue to do so. And if the organizations then that are best placed to move forward this empowerment agenda are not empowered themselves, and state actors and IDAs and national development agencies are not doing the work we expect them to do, how are we going to get anywhere close to achieving SDG 5 by 2030?
Yes. My answer here is a little bit shorter than the former one. I agree with you very much that the climate today, right, is less receptive, less supportive of what you could say in relative terms, right, might have been 20 years ago. Not that ever was substantial. On the other hand, right, if these women-led organizations are going to be able to continue their work, we know that they are not, by any means, self-sufficient, self-supporting, right? So obviously they have to count on the support of others, right? The support of others is becoming narrower, but it still exists, The support in the past has been due to very progressive development agencies in some European countries. The countries that come to mind would be the Dutch, the Germans, right? Certainly those in the Nordic countries also have been very supportive of that. They continue to be supportive, perhaps, less than in the past, right? We also have an overall environment in the world, right? Call it globalization, call it neoliberalism, call it the two together, the origin really matters less than the fact that they are very present. At this moment, with a great emphasis in productivity, right? This notion that gives so much priority to economic and to economic aspects, to economics, which is felt at all levels in society and in all institutions. Obviously, there is much less interest than before. It's a rather hostile environment in which one can work. But I don't think we have an alternative. What is there to be invented, right? We have to rely on the support of others. And I think here it helps to look at this problem in a historic perspective, right? In many of the major problems in the world, the impetus, the effort really came from those who were oppressed, right? From those who were marginalized. But they always counted with the support of the others in the dominant group that were sensitive and sympathetic to the causes of the other. One example that comes to my mind really is the anti-slavery movement, right? Both in the UK and the US. If it didn't have the protection of some powerful white anti-slavery persons, the struggle would have been much more difficult, and some spaces would not have been created. I find same for apartheid. There was a great deal of impetus and struggle on the part of the Black Africans, but they were also able to persuade, to have the support of some of the groups that were able to come to their help. I think that the situation is not as optimal as we would want, but it's something that still produces spaces for action, and that what one has to do is to constantly monitor the environment and see where you see groups or institutions or persons who can serve as advocates and play this very useful role. So this change, as I see it, is going to be massively in the hands of those who are suffering from the particular injustices, but also relying strategically on the support of those who, because of their position, have access to areas of influence and that can make a difference.
I just want to pick up a little bit on what you've just said and link it to what you said earlier about the co-optation of the term empowerment, emptied of its deep content that it originally had. If our terminology, and by ours I mean women's rights organizations, those fighting for gender equality and women's rights, our terminology, our language is being co-opted by the state, by agencies, and we still also have to rely on them to sponsor and support our organizations. Am I being a little bit too cynical? Because it seems to me that the squeeze is coming from all directions. So funding is being cut, your work, your terminology, your approaches are being co-opted. What is left for you to do?
Well, you can still say, thanks for using my concept, but that's not what I meant, right? That's not what I meant. You're forgetting these other aspects, Yes. And if indeed, and you can take them to task on the objectives that they have expressed, right?
Mhm.
You could say to them, if you really want to get to that objective, you have to consider this other path. You cannot just bypass it or ignore it. I think that there is a role for reason too, right?
Mhm.
It has limitations, but there's a role for reason.
Okay. I'm being told that we have some questions that are coming up from some of the people who are participating remotely. So there is a question here. Question for Nelly. It says, for achieving SDG 5, key challenges that need addressing are poverty, inequality, and violence against women and girls. In the end, to fight these issues, significant financial means are necessary. What is your impression? Will governments make the necessary funds available? How high is this on the international agenda compared to other goals?
Very good point, very good point. Since I am in an area where I should be advancing progress and believing in progress, I don't want to be too cynical, right? On the other hand, when you look at the progress that has been taken with EFA, right, since 1990, that progress has been very slow, right? So I think we should say, on the part of government action, there is a strong element of symbolism. Look at me, I'm interested in your situation, I'm going to do something, right?
Yeah.
Definitely, there is this effort to appear as a group or as an institution or as a nation that wants to make a big difference, but in fact, actions are lack a great deal of that. Poverty, I think, is an enormous problem that we find today. It's a chronic problem, has been with us since inception of society, really. Because of the competitiveness between countries and between individuals and between firms, definitely, we all know this for a fact. I mean, I'm just repeating. Globalization has created a very small number of winners and a large number of losers, right? And if we look at the consequences of that on wealth creation and income distribution, you find that it is worsening over time. You know? We have all these technologies and all these advances, and at the same time, we continue to have poverty. I wish that by 2030, there would be no poverty, right? I doubt it. I doubt it very much. You know, it will be alleviated in some countries. It might be worsening in some others. So I don't think the agencies and the governments are going to put the amount of resources that they need, right? I see as part of a struggle that is going to take many generations, right? To have these nice objectives by 2030, it's a good exercise, right? But we cannot take it too literally. It will take much more effort, yes? And inequality and poverty, of course, are different, right? But the two will continue to exist and even be exacerbated. Right?
Thank you. Another question here. Somebody's asking, they say, they'd be interested in your opinion related to quotas that are put in place to ensure women are represented in certain PhD programs. So we're looking at the higher ed sector now. So for example, in computer science, they have affirmative action for women to get into those places. Also quotas for leadership roles, etc. And also because we increasingly hear comments like, oh, she's a quota woman. So, but when we have these quotas in place, then more and more we hear people say things like, oh, she's just a quota woman. And so maybe this is just a temporary thing, but it's certainly a new form of discrimination at the moment. What do you think about that? So your thoughts on the whole idea of quotas, the pros and the cons of quotas?
Yes. I know that those who are affected by quotas negatively will be the first ones to say this is, discrimination against us. It's a natural defense reaction, and I can live with that. The question of quotas, again, if you look at that historically, right? Quotas in governments in countries that have been able to dramatically change the presence of women, right? The presence of women in politics, the presence of women in higher education, has played a tremendous role, a tremendous role. That some of those affected don't like it, yes, and it's natural because quotas doesn't imply a win-win situation at the same time. In the long term, yes, it does. In the long term, it does. So what I'm saying is that I'm a firm believer in quotas. Okay, I think that if you want to make changes, you have to the extent that it's possible, you have to force changes, right? And quota is a way of saying, sorry, we have waited for you. We don't see the change. We need to push it. It doesn't mean that quotas should not be revisited, right? We need to see whether they are working or not, because sometimes the quota is mentioned as a solution to a problem that needs a much deeper understanding. One of those cases is the quotas in India, right? For the lower castes, they have had, and they still have, quotas that ostensibly make it possible for them to move to civil posts, to move to higher education. But if their previous education has not been of quality, by the time they graduate, even by the time they graduate from university, they I should say, they don't graduate from university in large numbers for them to use the quotas. So there are lots of unfulfilled quotas in India. And of course, people will say, "Oh, they are not prepared." Well, no, those who were prepared were so very few that they cannot really enter the picture. Some countries, the United States being a case in point, sees quotas as totally anathema, totally contrary to the notion of freedom, right? And yes, the term has been used of that you're discriminating against those who had nothing to do with oppression, right? That's the philosophical position there. So in most countries, certainly including the United States, they use the term affirmative action, right? Affirmative action is a very partial and superficial solution to the problem, because essentially what it says is you have the right to compete with others, and you have the right for me to look at your CV, but it doesn't say what I will do with your case, right? And if I don't like it, end of story. So quotas is saying, wait a minute, this idea of progress doesn't simply mean that you will pay attention to other cases, but that you will create a space for other cases. The charge that it has created mediocrity, right? It's a false charge. It's a false charge in the sense that why? Because you are a minority, you could not be equally prepared and equally competent, you know? In fact, since there was a repression of so many of those minorities that were competent, you could say the pool of competent minorities is greater than the pool of white competent people, right? Simply because there was oppression. You will hear that, and I will say, it's likely that that will be expressed, but if you are certain of your own ability, you know, ignore that. Ignore that. Don't take as a disqualifier of your competence. Yes.
Do you, on the issue of quotas, to what extent do you think that some of the people's misunderstanding of what quotas are supposed to be doing and the need for having quotas is related to the fact that perhaps we haven't done enough around what you mentioned very early on, that if we're asking for transformation in gender relations, we are asking those who hold power, who have positions of privilege, who are making decisions, to give up that power, to move aside from those positions of privilege and power, and let others in, let women in, or let minorities in, whatever the case may be. Have we been good enough at explaining that is what we're asking for ultimately? And when we ask for that, as you said earlier, the change in power structures has never been one where the powerful have just woken up one morning and said, here's some power, we're very sorry for the inequalities of before. Those who haven't had power have had to struggle very hard to get it. So if we don't explain that well enough and have strategies that empower those who are seeking power and enable those who are being asked to give up power to be ready for a new reality, then we're almost shooting ourselves in the foot before we've gotten started.
I think that explaining will make a positive contribution. I don't think that the oppressed operates solely on logical premises, right? It might reject that logic and say, okay, it makes sense, but really in the final analysis, I'm going to be worse off. But it certainly helps a great deal. And I think that here is the role of education in terms of showing individuals in the safe space that a classroom is, what it means, right? To have a privileged position and what it means to be the underdog, so to speak, right? Information, explanations help a great deal. And I agree with you. Perhaps we haven't done enough. Certainly in the school systems, discussions of this nature that will go until under the civics curriculum or the social sciences curriculum are not sufficiently covered. So this is an area that indeed could be further explored. Yes.
Okay, we have some more questions coming from the outside. This question says, does the push by agencies such as the Department for International Development in the UK and the World Bank and others for girls' education support women's empowerment aims, or are they mostly instrumental and a distraction? Do they add oxygen to the larger movement, or do they suck out the oxygen from that space? Questions.
I wouldn't put it in those dramatic senses, I don't think it's that either or. I think that there are good intentions. There are better analytical papers than in the past. I have seen an excellent one that is really looking at these questions of, are we making a positive difference, or in fact worsening that? What I'm saying here is that some of those statements need to be further analyzed, unpacked, and see to what extent they are really going to make a difference. But the big aspect of all of this is that when you look at those statements, as important as they are, because organizations do speak through those policies, right? The bottom line, the bottom effort is what happens at the project level, when the loan is given, when the project is developed. And there I see that individuals who work for those organizations do not seem to have a full understanding of the issue, or they want to act on a slight understanding of what it takes to advance. So they have projects that are very modest in the final analysis of what they are trying to do. I would say the challenge there, in addition to what the policy might imply or not, is to make sure that all of these institutions that seek ostensibly, right, to make a change, undergo the training that they need. It's incredible, but even today, after so many years, you talk to key administrators of these organizations, and they say, oh, my subordinates, they don't use it. But those in lower and middle levels have received training. That training is very brief, it's non-recurrent, non-repetitive, so there's no professional development along the lines of gender. And they themselves have not had the training that they need. So they will say things as courteous as they are. Oh, I have 3 daughters, so I know what you mean. Oh, my wife is a professional, so I know what you mean. They don't, right? But it's that kind of underestimation of what it needs to be prepared to deal with such issues, such as the social transformation of gender.
Yes. This one says, what are the current trends among researchers who research gender in education? Do they get published at similar rates with other priority topics? Are the grants still there for doing research on gender in education? And what advice do you have for critical researchers wanting to contribute to the field?
2 things, I should say. The one on the rate of being published, right? I don't have the elements to discuss.
Yes.
I serve in editorial boards, and particular as peer reviewers. If an article is of good quality, right? I don't think we have a special anti-gender treatment article. But I wouldn't say what is the current situation, the current trend. I don't believe it has gone under. It has decreased. But this is my opinion. The other point is on the publication of critical articles. Publication of critical articles is always much more difficult than publications that fit within the parameters of experimentation, the pre-post, the quantitative, right? So the articles that, this is a big generalization, usually the top tier articles, right, have a number of areas that they will pursue, and they are rather narrow in delineation.
Mhm.
So to enter with a gender analysis, right, in some ways, goes against the grain.
Mhm.
So it might have more of a difficulty in being published, but I wouldn't say it will not be published, right? It's always much more difficult to publish articles with critical perspective
Mhm.
than to have those that assume that the social sciences is totally neutral and objective, and you don't have to take a position, right? You cannot talk about gender issues without taking a position, because the implicit position is the status quo has to change, right?
Right.
So it's there, and a few, I would say, scientists might say, well, no, it has to be totally neutral. So in that sense, critical articles always find more difficulties than a mainstream article,
Mhm.
but still it's going to be published, right?
Mhm.
What I should say is that you have to make a stronger effort to have a high quality.
Right.
Perhaps not just do it on your own.
Mhm.
Look for a team that can bring a combination of ideas and mutual critique to make it stronger, right? And then produce.
Oh, we've had that one. Okay, one more question on the paper. It says, "Hi Nelly, in your paper you speak of NGOs helping women get individual and collective agency through education. What about teacher unions? How can and do they work on that too? And is there any difference between teacher unions working on this issue and NGOs?" Which was actually my third question as well. So thank you, whoever sent that question in.
Yes. I haven't spoken much on teachers' unions simply because I don't know sufficiently about them. Right? It's an area in which I'm beginning to become more familiar. Uh, some teacher unions are progressive, others are not. I presume that I will find a great deal of diversity among them. That that two institutions are very different in kind, right? Because the teachers unions have a wider a range of interests and problems to pursue. The women's movement is very focused on the question of gender. So the production is going to be different. But I think that teacher unions, especially through the teachers, right, the majority of whom in the world are women, should be able to do something very useful and very important to the question of the treatment of gender in the schools. Yes, and I will not say any more because then you come with your question, which is parallel, right?
Yes. Okay. Okay, so then my question links to the question that was just posed by somebody outside. Was, I said, do you see a role for trade unions, particularly educators' trade unions, in moving the women's empowerment agenda forward? And I asked if you could say something about what that role could be.
Yes. In your question, you had mentioned, of course, I have read all your questions ahead of time, which is normal.
Yes.
In that question, you had mentioned that what can be done through teacher unions structures and programs, right?
Yes.
And I wasn't clear about structures, and I asked you what you mean by structures, and you said the creation of units such as the women's education or women's issues unit. Yes, I think that from other cases, not trade unions, not teachers unions, the organizational, the decision to fit in the organization a structure, such as the women's unit, right? However vulnerable, even without funds, is important because it has become institutionalized. It's there, right? The person in charge might not always be called to the first level meetings, but it will be consulted. People know that there is such a unit. They will be more careful in what they do. right? If nothing else. So the creation of women's education units or women's issues units is something to welcome a great deal, right? And certainly you can operate through them. Also, what I would say, and I like to use a historical perspective when I look at things, is that in a number of countries, and I'm talking now outside the labor unions, in a number of countries where the government has created women's issues unit, at the beginning it was, the person in charge was politically appointed. She was the wife or the brother, the sister of some president or some minister. So there was a great deal of arbitrariness. There was hardly any funds. And because of the arbitrariness in appointments, the people who were there had very limited understanding of what they were supposed to do. I'm talking especially what I know about the Latin American situation. Over time, those offices have been populated by younger people, people who had not that political connection or ascription to the position, and who had graduated from women's studies programs in universities. So they have come with a much greater degree of understanding of what needs to be done. The funding continues to be modest. It's a constant struggle. But those women units today have much more influence than in the past. So it has been you have to look at that historically, right? Not now, but what happens 5 years, what happens 10 years. Time alone doesn't solve all problems, but you need time to understand progression, right? The other aspect that you were that was being mentioned in your question, what they can do, right? I think they could do a lot, right? And I have identified some, and I'm presenting them as suggestions that of things that could be done. I see action at two levels. One would be what I can do as a teacher with students, right? So it would be the relationship teacher-student, or if you call it teacher-community, right? That's an area of action that unions could be active in. The other area is what I see as the area between teachers and administrators, a big area that has not been, in my mind, sufficiently exploited in the positive sense of the word. So what could be done in terms of the relation teacher-students or teacher community, right? Especially along the lines of what to do in the classroom. One that has been mentioned in the past by many, this is not going to be original, but it's the promotion of sex education. Sex education in the broader sense of that term, right? Not sex education that be careful you can become pregnant and be careful if you can have AIDS. No, it's something deeper, right? Something that goes beyond anatomy, beyond physiology, to understanding social relations, right? For instance, the silly notion that just say no, right? It's completely at odds with reality, right? In a situation where girls play a subordinate role, right? To say no is preposterous. To expect that, right? It's not likely to happen. So is that kind of understanding of how sex is negotiated in society and how it happens, and what are the opportunities for that to be enjoyed? What are those opportunities that create exploitation by others, right? So that would be an important area to have, this one of sex education. And I would say sex education for girls and boys, right? Both of them need it. At some point, initially, I think it might be better to separate them and then put them together. Those strategies you can decide regarding with respect to your own society, what would be more applicable, what would be more acceptable by others, right? But that would be a point. The other one, which I think is one that is likely to create antibodies, right? More resistance, but again, it's one that teachers should have the opportunity to negotiate, is to promote a discussion of negative cultural practices, right? We continue to say, this is my culture, but no, your culture has positive aspects and has negative aspects. If you want to act by dressing in, let us say, purple every day, and you say, this is my cultural practice, go ahead, no problem. But if your cultural practice starts infringing in someone's rights, in someone's well-being, your culture is not absolutely yours, right? It's something that is also affecting me, and therefore we should contest it, right? So in some regions of the world, right, some practices are extreme, right? Some cultural practices are extreme. I'm referring here to the practices of child marriage, forced marriage, female genital mutilation. Those are so extreme that they have been recognized by most institutions as being cultural practices that should be confronted, right? But when you look at the questions of gender relations in society, most of the practices are more subtle, more nuanced, right? Uh, Female genital mutilation is horrible, is extreme, right? Doesn't happen in Latin America, it doesn't happen in Asian countries, right? But doesn't mean they don't have cultural practices that you should. Right? And there are also, if you look at the European countries, lots of cultural practices that are negative to the conditions of women. So I think there would be a great deal of value understanding what, and to put them in the framework of cultural practices. Not just this is what we do, but it's a cultural practice that has certain consequences. And here I'm referring to things that happened in the development of everyday life. Everyday life, right? Things, little things. They don't have to be big things to create these notions of separate conditions of masculinity and femininity, for instance, right? And I'm referring here to beliefs that women can follow, but they cannot lead, right? That caring for others is only a feminine attribute, that men cannot possibly, care for their children the same way that mothers do, right? Maybe in some cases, but it doesn't have to be so, right? We forget the conditions of socialization. And the practices too that women can do certain jobs and not others, right? It happens every day, or certain tasks and others. It happens every day. I think that a good understanding of these cultural practices should be taken into the classroom and brought for discussion, because it's in the creation of everyday life performance and everyday life activities that these conceptions of masculinity and femininity are built, right? So that would be one thing. The other one, my third point, is that yes, now after so many years, finally, agencies and governments are recognizing the importance of school-related gender-based violence, right? It's a major problem. It's a major problem, definitely. And it's a problem about which you don't have precise statistics. And you don't have precise statistics because it has not been considered something that's detrimental, right? Some essential. And I would say that teachers should also be in this question, right? Of the violence that exists in the classes, in the schools, manifested in sexual harassment, in some extreme cases in forms of rape, right? The kinds of exchanges that sometimes happens of sex for grades, right? That occurs, and sex for exploiting the poverty of some of the students too, right? To give them money so that they can continue their study. That definitely should be part of that. It's a big task. What is being paid attention by agencies, what I would say is amplify the attention to see that violence, not in terms of the grossest way of expression, but some that are more subtle. And also, when we talk about gender-based violence, the implicit assumption seems to be that the problem is particularly either between students or between male teachers and students. But there's another aspect that is also quite present, and that is between teachers, between male teachers and female teachers. And then I would say a fourth point about what unions could do, and I think unions and women teachers could do in those unions, would be to work more in the promotion of safe spaces within the school. Here I see a value for the utilization of extracurricular activities where students can have clubs, where students can have the newspaper of the school, use the blackboard, put little news, right? The fact that they are playing an active role, I think is very beneficial. I have been privileged to see the schools that were created by FAWE in Africa. I think those are very thought out, clever contributions to improving the friendliness of schools, and that they need to be brought to scale. A number of countries have it, but still the fuller coverage through more parts of the country would be helpful. And again, since women teachers are there, those are things that they could foster and that they could promote relatively, with no major cost. You could say to the student, you have to go home now at 2 o'clock and you stay for an extra hour. This is what we're going to do. I'm sure that most families will welcome that notion, and if there are no resources, at least, well, financial resources, it needs a great deal of voluntarism on the part of the teacher, for sure, which, if you have a cost, you have the time, right? So the question would be to convince parents, to convince the students to stay there and then begin exploring things. I think there's a space that needs to be.
Could I pause you? So on that aspect of, you're talking about what trade unions could do to contribute to the empowerment agenda, and you're focusing here specifically looking at teachers as teachers in the classroom, and through the union, the specific issues they could do, they could touch on in relation with their students. And I wonder, because that demands resources, it demands that the teachers are trained, right, to be able to address school-related gender-based violence, to be able to address the construction of masculinities and femininities in the classroom with students. You need some prior training yourself. The trade union can go so far, because obviously they've got a big plate with many different competing agendas. To what extent should the trade union struggle to provide that training, or should they really be advocating that government make that training available to the teachers that are delivering education in its schools?
Well, that's one of the recommendations I would make, that this notion of training teachers should be incorporated in teacher training programs, at the university, at the normal schools. So that's one thing that they could do. Press upon governments to include the curriculum, this in the regular curriculum, right? But then we go back to the structure. They have created women's units, right? So that should be their priority. They should fund them enough for that to happen. Otherwise, you don't want to have just a figurehead being the women's unit. You should be able to have that as a priority that you have. You mentioned that unions have competing priorities. Yes, but you could press that this priority should be put on the front burner. That is not something that you do after you have solved 5 other issues, right? And again, it's a matter of, I say we need to train administrators. Be sure that those union leaders themselves, right, have received the training that they need for understanding. One thing is to be sympathetic to the issue, right, to say yes, something can be done. And the other one is to have the tools, the conceptual tools, the analytical tools, the strategic ability to put that in place. And it shouldn't be taken as an insult to say, have you considered taking more training, right? Nobody tells you when you're a high school student, have you considered going to college, right? No, they all want to go to college. So it's not an insult, it's the next step, right? You should welcome that.
Right. Okay, so to bring you back now, you have the specific points on this teachers, the relation between teachers and administrators and what they could do there to push the empowerment agenda forward.
And the second one was at the level of teachers and administrators, right? In a way, I have already touched with that. The essential point was that administrators, those who are trained to be principals, most of the time, the training is on management, the training is on discipline, the training is on obeying laws, legislation, avoiding corruption. But we are not thinking enough about introducing gender issues in the training of administrators. In many countries, there's no special training for administrators. I mean, you don't go to a training school for administrators. It's usually you become a principal of a school or the headmaster as a teacher, right? Who has exceeded in his performance, or someone who finally wants to be a principal, because sometimes you don't want to have that heady administrator. What I'm saying is that those persons, in many cases, themselves haven't been trained on gender. I think it would be very important for unions if they are taking this issue seriously, right? If they are just not endorsing things as many agencies do, to say, you want to be a principal, right? Give me some understanding, show some evidence that you would know how to deal with gender issues. And you could have workshops for them, to prepare them, and also you could have examinations, right? At the moment that you want to progress from teacher to administrators, that put scenarios there, and they ask you how to deal with those scenarios. And if you don't show great competence, but you have competence in other aspects, you might be told, you need some training on this. We like you, but you need some training on that to promote that kind of coverage.
Great. So I like very much what you're saying about the fact that it happens at many different levels, and that where teachers are located, as long as they're equipped with the training to deal with these issues, they're actually in a very, very powerful position to push the agenda forward, from the classroom right through to the people who are administrating and managing the educational institutional environment.
Yes.
Okay, so we have some more external questions. Yes. Somebody says here, could you expand on the training in gender awareness for field staff? Are there political considerations that mediate what's possible, and that's why agencies focus on numbers and test scores over these more power-related issues? And is anybody doing it well?
Very good question.
Yes.
Yes. Most definitely, there are political considerations, right? And
Yes.
here, usually the political consideration is, are we going to be insulting someone or confronting someone, either cultural patterns or very ingrained habits that the person has, right? They might not really locate them as cultural, but they're ingrained habits. Definitely, you will have resistance to that. There are political considerations that you can take into place. I would say the number of the successful programs are smaller than the number of others that are, more mainstream in nature. It is an area that deserves solid attention. Let me say, one of the recent documents coming from USAID is looking at the question of removing stereotypes in textbooks and preparing teachers to deal with a better content in the curriculum. I think it's a wonderful positive step, right? It's something that can serve as a point of departure to have other things added to that. When you look at the change in the classrooms, and this is in relative terms, I think that the easiest step that you can take is to remove the gender stereotypes in textbooks. As difficult it might be, it's still much easier.
It will have a big impact.
Yes, much easier than other things. You might have to go by stages, right? In the changes that you have, but there are cases in which they have been successful. What it would need, and some people do not necessarily agree with me on this, but what it will need is to look at the curriculum and to have a graduated entrance, right? What a kindergarten kid needs is different from a 13-year-old, it's different from a 16-year-old. So someplace has to take the effort to say, we are going to have a transformative curriculum that is looking at the question of gender in its complexity, and we are going to deal with the chronological age, the developmental age as necessary. Right? What I have seen is that this is not happening, and then some persons who want to have change, drop something that to some conservative parents is like dynamite. Right? Let me give the case of Peru. They wanted to have in the curriculum the notion of gender, right? A very powerful concept, a very necessary concept, amplified to mean that gender can be any sexual orientation that you have, right? That created lots of antibodies in the country, unnecessary antibodies, because it didn't have to be presented in such a way that here you are, right? Uh, if you didn't have a building up of understanding, a building up of practices, that kind of very emancipatory objective can backfire, right? So in that sense, one could say there are some strategies that I myself might not like because they are too gradual, might be necessary, right? Because you don't want to create a counter action to what you are proposing. Definitely, the question of having a transformative curriculum has political implications, and you have to take them into account.
Yeah, what you're saying about what happened in Peru, we saw a similar phenomenon in France just 2 or 3 years ago, where they were also trying to introduce, it was in fact a voluntary initiative for primary schools to just present the idea that gender is socially constructed. That brought very big backlash from many different sectors, which was surprising to see, but yeah. We have a question here. This person says, are there examples where the progressive men's movement, is there one, works together with the women's movement to achieve gender equality? As you said in the beginning, it is so important to have men on board in this agenda. So it's two parts of the question. They're asking first, is there such a thing as progressive men's movement? And if so, does it work together with the women's movement to move forward the gender equality agenda?
I would say certainly there are progressive men. And the number of progressive men is becoming greater than in the past, for sure. I don't know about many explicit progressive men's movements. Okay, maybe it's my lack of knowledge, but I am not at this moment able to identify them. You don't have to wait till there is a progressive men's movement. You can work with men who are at this moment very willing to accept the change and the challenge that it would mean. You know, I have heard men saying, I realize that opening and this is in the context of higher education, I realize that the fact that women now can be professors, right, has meant that that men are competing with women. That didn't happen before, but that's all right with me, right? Which means that they are willing to understand that you have change, right? You have to break eggs, right? Something has to change in a significant way. You know, if change meant I am going to be totally affected, then what change is that, right? They have to recognize that it does take, a new equilibrium.
Right. Okay, new question coming in here. Somebody says, within NGOs, unions, universities, schools, and governments, isn't there sometimes a fragmented and territorial approach to gender, class, and race, which leads to fights for visibility, resources, and explanatory power? Are there ways to integrate the approaches, or does that lead to muddiness? Are there any examples where it's been done well, or is the conflict just a given reality? So I guess the person here is alluding to this idea that either where there's been a tendency for governments to put together committees or agencies previously dealing with gender, race, class issues separately, putting them all together. What about the competitiveness between those different agendas, everybody pushing their agenda as the top priority?
I would say you still need different groups, right? You still need a group that is looking at racial issues, a group that is looking at gender issues. You could say it's fragmented, right? But I would prefer to call it specialized labor because there are different issues that they come into place. There's nothing to prevent. In fact, a good gender agency or women's movement should be quite sensitive to the intersectionality of it, right? By the same token, those who work in racial issues have so many problems of employment and housing and social benefits that might not be equally felt by women
Mhm.
that deserve specialized attention. Within their work, they should be sensitive to what are the intentionalities within, right? Within race, because within race you still have class and age and gender, of course, right? I do see them working separately. I don't know if I would say that in the cases that I know that it has come to a case of fragmentation of resources,
Mhm.
right? Um, because resources, I don't think that the resources would be greater if they are unified. And I'm not sure that the unification would be necessarily more effective than otherwise.
Mhm.
Uh, and also, I should say that the competition that happens within some groups is greater than the competition among some of the groups that the person who raised the question mentioned. For instance, uh, the academic women or academic men who want to do research on gender don't compete for resources given to the NGOs.
Mhm.
Don't compete with resources given to a government office dealing with X or gender. We're
Mhm.
dealing with different pools of money
Mhm.
and different areas that support you. So in that sense, the fragmentation that I see happening occurs along different lines. And let me tell you what are the lines that I see. And I cannot say this is the case all over the world.
Mhm.
I can only say this seems to be the case in some gender programs, especially in the United States, right? To some extent, I think it's also the case in the UK. The question of gender is also being so specialized, right? That it has been divided into gender for equality issues, right? Transformation, right? Where I locate myself.
Mhm.
And then there's another area, which is also very popular, much more specialized, which is an area of gender that looks at the question of representation and different images and the social imaginary, which is much more cultural in nature. They call it part of the cultural term as opposed to the material aspect. Right? I think that the two, of course, overlap. Without doubt, they overlap. But I can see a great deal of specialization in taking issues that in the second arena that are so sophisticated and at the same time so abstract and at the same time so distant from the reality of men and women. As you know very well, Madeleine, one of the key points in some of the schools dealing with gender in universities is that we should not be talking about men and women because thereby we are creating an artificial difference, right? True, the discourse also creates reality. And if we're talking about women, we're saying they are women, and if we're talking about men, we're saying they are men who, in the final analysis, have to be different. But if we move into that discourse that we should avoid binaries, that discourse is avoid binaries. Binaries is so old, it's so passé. The Greek may have used it, but I am not using it. What it really means is that what are you going to do with the reality of female genital mutilation? What are you going to do with the reality that women don't have equal access to property rights? Are you going to say, we shouldn't talk about that too? Then, in my view, that completely depoliticizes the question because your key categories of analysis and mobilization disappear. Then you shouldn't talk about that. I would hope that 1 year in the future, I don't know, it's going to be, 2300 or 2500. I don't know that. But I would hope that at that time, the situation has been so resolved that, in fact, talking about men and women creates a difference, but not the stark difference with the stark differentiation of rights and privileges that we have today. At that time, I would say, fine, but that would have been a result of a struggle that took place prior to such a milder differentiation between men and women. But if today, 2017, we have such an abandonment of these key concepts, the concepts of men and women, I think we are losing the battle right now.
Doesn't some of that challenge, though, come from the recognition that's coming from newer movements for us to recognize that in the space between men and women, there are other people whose rights are being marginalized and who deserve equal attention and should be integrated into the whole push for equality and equity and empowerment.
I think that is very much part of that, yes. And I think that their rights should be completely incorporated. But to have the rights incorporated doesn't mean that you get away with major categories of differentiation and oppression. You know.
We have some more questions. Yes. Right. Here's a question focusing on BRAC. Says, how do you feel about the decision by BRAC that used to empower local women in a non-profit school environment to opt for converting into a for-profit model like Bridge? You're familiar with the Bridge International School, yes. Who is looking at privatization in education's impact on women's empowerment? Is there any research and actions of note? Very, very interesting question. Yeah. So BRAC have apparently moved from a model where they are looking to empower women very much from a non-profit making perspective to one where they are mimicking institutions like Bridge International and taking a more for-profit approach. What do you think about that? Very shocking shift, if I must be honest, actually.
Yes. If that is what's going on, I think it's a mistake on the part of BRAC. My understanding was that it was Bridge that was trying to copy BRAC.
Right.
Copying the model of the one teacher. Yes. So I don't know to what extent Bridge is being able to change the values that BRAC has had. I wasn't aware that when that BRAC is now going to say we are only going to have professional meaning, because they were professional teachers. They were very much. I have been able to visit BRAC on 2 occasions, and I have been extremely positively impressed by the work that they do, right? Because indeed, they use the teacher from the community, a bright high school graduate from the community, and then had that person receive training and receive regular support. To me, the key word is recurrent support, not just a one-shot operation, but over and over, right?
Continuous professional.
We all do that, sometimes on our own, sometimes it is given to us, but it's extremely necessary. So I was very impressed with the work of BRAC and how they, in selecting teachers, they also made it possible for those individuals to be recognized in the society, to have an identity as teachers. And it was something very positive. I don't know whether Bridge has been able to influence BRAC along those lines, but if that is happening, I do think it would be a loss. It would be a loss of the initial effort to have women engaged as teachers.
Yeah, the second part of that question was asking about existing research looking at the impact of privatization in and of education on women's rights to education. I'm certainly not aware, and actually that's a gap that EI is very aware of and trying to pull together our resources so we start looking at that. But I'm not aware, there's a little bit of research that looks at that, but they're not as much as we would like to see. I don't know if you're aware of any research that looks at privatization, but focusing specifically on the impact it has on gender equality.
I am not familiar with that either.
Yeah. We'll check and see if there are any more. No more questions for now. Did you have any further questions? I posed my 3 questions to you. I guess. Well, actually, I wanted to, earlier when you were speaking about, when you first started talking about what teachers' unions could do through their members who are teachers in the classroom, the majority of whom you said are women, and therefore one would hope that they're in a position of openness and willing to gain the training and then to address these issues in the classroom. And your first point that you mentioned was sexuality education, which I would tend to agree with. But by the same token, that issue is particularly tricky, strongly contested, and indeed, when educators try to touch on that issue, that's where they might find themselves coming into conflict with parents, the wider community. And so, certainly in what I've seen in EI, education unions find it a very difficult issue to kind of embrace and move forward. And recently we've been, myself and another colleague, speaking to colleagues at UNESCO who very much want to engage with teachers' unions to try to understand actually what is some of the context specific, because we can't forget context in all of this. You mentioned this earlier. Your country, your region is going to very much define how you approach things. But yeah, it makes it very tricky for education unions to take it up, I think, because in the wider society, it remains such a strongly contested issue.
Yes, it is a tricky issue. It's a highly debated issue, but it's something that has to be tackled, you know. And for all of these aspects that are heavily contested in society, you have to enter the arena with an understanding that you're going to be into a trial and error process, right? There will be many things in which you will be making a mistake, right? Hopefully not such a serious mistake that the whole thing is paralyzed, but go with a attitude that you don't have perfect solutions, that it will have to be negotiated, modified over time, but the option of saying, since I don't have the perfect solution, I'm going to stay away from that, then is, again, giving up before time. Deal with people, identify people who have thoughts about this, who can strategize with you, create a committee of different stakeholders, and take them seriously, discuss with them regularly and develop programs that, as you have said, are very sensitive to contextual historical moments, and work on that. Of course, it's going to be, a controversial issue, but if you from the beginning say, oh, it's a controversial issue, I better not touch it, then you haven't done much about it.
Then I had a further question. Thinking back to some of your comments from earlier, you noted the fact that within the NDGs, there had been some attempts to link gender parity with education. When we move to SDG 5 now, we see that the reference to education is taken out and all the education is in SDG 4, which EI fought strongly for, and I'm not casting any aspersions on that at all. My concern, though, and it's something, excuse me, I know that academics in the UK have also noticed and been concerned about, is the split between, or to put it very simply, that education doesn't seem to be a feminist issue, when in fact it definitely is. In the Beijing Platform for Action, I think it's paragraph 12 is very detailed and very strong in what it says about the role that education plays in achieving women's rights and gender equality. But there does seem to be that shift now, or a distinction, parallel tracks running, gender equality and women's rights on one hand, education movement on the other hand. What's happened there, and is it detrimental?
This may have been totally unintended, right? But the consequences are serious, in the sense that those who are going to be looking at education are going to be thinking, education, men and women and everybody needs the same thing. And then when we go to empowerment, the role of education is slighted, right? There should be ways that the two can be brought together. There should be ways, I'm not saying that they will find them, there should be ways that the two are much more integrated. Because, again, the question of knowledge is essential to your sense of what needs to be done. If you don't have that understanding, then you accept the situation as normal. You don't contest your reality. On the question of the SDGs, regardless of what they might say, right? For each of the targets and what needs to be done and all that, the element that carries the weight, from the government's perspective, right? And this is, and all of these goals are going to be acted upon by the governments, right? Is that precious indicator, right?
Yeah.
If that indicator, in the final analysis, the operational indicator is, again, parity, that is what's going to be happening. That's going to happen, namely that they will only look at numbers and leave it at that. Right? And if that's the case, then call it what you want, but we are not in a sustainable development process. So it's something that needs to be contested, and be very attentive to what are the final indicators of work. What are the final indicators of work? Is there that the actual potential change will happen or not?
Here's a question, very direct. Nelly, you are a known critic of the World Bank. Are you following the work of the Education Commission that purports to expand education equity for girls and its proposal for a new loan mechanism? Should we be worried about a new international financial institution coming on the scene? Are there any new publications that you're working on?
The latest, that was what, 3 months ago, was a critique, and I think the person who raised the question knows it. We're critiquing the new funding mechanisms for education. And I will just say in brief terms, what do I see as potentially negative in nature? The positive aspect of finding these new funding mechanisms is that hopefully, right, and that's the big hope, the persons behind, and this is Gordon Brown and his team, will be able to convince various enterprises, international financial institutions, to give more money to education. So the promise of greater resources for education is wonderful. It's not to be underestimated. Certainly education needs more money than now. There are so many things that will not be a reality unless more resources are allocated, be that for training, be that for materials, be that for access to computers. Yet, who is going to be in charge of that support? The financial institutions, right? And the financial institutions have already determined their agenda. And in their agenda, gender is marginally implicated, in the sense that, of course, you're going to consider girls, but something specifically addressed to girls is not there. I don't know who is going to be in those large banks in charge of issues that have this social nature or social responsibility in charge. They even seem to have an agenda that is very technical, improve performance in tests, have greater computers in the classroom, right? So in a way, although they will deny that this is the case, I already spoke to a member of this committee that said, you have misinterpreted me. And I said, well, if you think otherwise, show me where it's in the document. It wasn't. It's not in the document unless I read their minds, The notion of what will be funded seems to have been already framed along 3-4 areas, specific areas. And if that is going to happen, I'm not clear that a gender agenda will be advanced. A gender agenda, they will say, is there, but explicit action on it doesn't come to the fore.
And to what extent, although I'm a little less familiar with this, if we do have a new financial mechanism specifically dedicated to education, might governments feel that they've been abdicated of what we've advocated for a long time, the percentage of GDP that should be spent on education? Are they going to channel all of that into this new mechanism? Or might this just be a loophole that people could use to say, well, that mechanism exists, so therefore we're absolved of this responsibility for funding public education through the state's coffers, so to speak?
That could happen, although the money is not coming from free. It's coming through loans, so either the governments give money to the budgets, right, or go and ask for loans with interest.
Right.
Either possibility is there.
No, I don't see any more new questions. We've got a little bit of time left. I don't know if you've got any further comments that you'd want to make, or just in general terms. We've run out of questions and our technical support has just left the room for a minute. So I don't know if there are more questions then, we just can't see them for the moment. So we're trying to fill some time, and I don't have any good jokes.
Well, I don't really have much to add other than to say that I did produce a PowerPoint that I would be happy to share. it's not on what we have discussed, but it's on my conception of empowerment. It's also present in a text form, but this one is accessible right now if people are interested. And just to say that I welcome the opportunity to have spoken with you about these issues, and if that the audience has additional questions, they can send them to you, and you can put them in some synthetic form and send those to me, and we can continue this conversation. It doesn't have to be just only now. So it's something to think about the future. I hope that we have opened some channels of communication and that we can explore issues. Some of the questions have asked for things that I hadn't thought of, right? So it's also good for me to be open to that. I didn't know that Bridge is now influencing BRAC. I didn't know that I didn't know to what extent there is research that is looking at the consequences of the private sector on women. So those are areas that certainly merit more exploration.
Well, from an EI point of view, starting off from this your 2015 paper on women's empowerment and education linking knowledge transformation was our kind of kickoff starting point. But I think through the discussion and in addressing the three questions I put you really managed to touch on a very wide range of the issues that Education International and our member organizations are concerned about when we're talking about gender equality, specifically as it relates to education. I think that your suggestion for what education unions could do through their members also touches indirectly, but I think in some ways also directly on the issue of gender equality within the trade union itself, because we can't make any assumptions, and the research that EI has done in recent years shows us that we continue to be in a situation where, in spite of membership in so many regions being majority female, the leadership invariably is male. So at the same time as trade unions are trying to work on gender equality within education, they're also working on gender equality issues within their own organizational structure. So it's kind of double task.
Yes. What you're saying reminds me of an experience I had with the major single union of teachers in this particular country. I went to visit them and I said, I wanted to know more about you, and they welcomed me, with open arms, and they were very gracious, discussing the question of privatization and teachers' salaries and promotion and everything that has to do with teachers' conditions. The moment that I raised gender issues, they look at their watch and they say, we're running out of time, we have to go. Your visit has been nice, and they really brought it to a close. And I thought, well, this might be representative of how they see gender, right? That it's an issue that, of course, is in their agenda, but up to a certain point. We need to deepen the conditions of gender relationships within trade unions, for sure.
Yeah, well, I think definitely for EI, it's being firmly on the agenda, and many of our member organizations also firmly have it on their agenda. The comments you made earlier about it not being enough to just have it on the agenda or to have, lovely rhetoric around it, but to actually make sure funding lines are available. If you have a women's committee, that within the union's core funds, money is made available for that committee to do its work. Those kinds of walking the talk, so to speak, actions are very, very important. Our support is back, technical support is back. We have no more questions. So we're pretty much wrapping up. As Nelly has said, that if there will be further questions, they can be sent in to us and we will put them to Nelly and she'll be happy to respond. There is a PowerPoint presentation that we can make available to participants. I think that's it. We're good to close. Thanks everyone, and thank you, Nelly.
Thank you too. Thank you to everybody.